Oh, happy day. You got Jim Sedore here. I am your personal preacher. And thanks for listening to the Bible Exposition channel. And welcome back to all my friends and listeners out there. This is Jim. And we're about to start on something a little rare. It's a Saturday podcast, and I'm doing this for a reason. I got a email from a fellow just the other day. This is a different person than the one I had mentioned last week, but still in all, a Catholic guy, probably about my age, 65 or thereabouts, and he's been listening to my teachings and noticed that I'm always coming down on the Catholic Church. And he says, well, what have you got against the Catholic Church? He says, I was born and raised in the Catholic Church, and everything I've been taught to believe spiritually comes from the Catholic religion. And I'm trying to figure out a way to answer this guy's question. So I came up with something that I think is fairly intriguing, actually. I have a book in my library. It's about 1,000 pages long or more. And the name of the book is The Story of Christianity. And it's by a man, very scholarly man, Justo Gonzalez. And it's the early church to the present day. And I can't read you the entire book, but I did make a number of notes as far as the early history timeline is concerned. And I just want to go over some of them because I think you're going to see. What is this guy's name? Oh, no kidding. Alexander. Oh, that's cool. I like that name. Anyway, Alex, I'm going to try, make sure that you've got a pen and paper handy. And I told you in my response that I was going to do this today, so I know you're out there listening. And this timeline should address the issues that concern all Christians. Now, in Jude 3, Jude, the half-brother of Jesus, says that we should contend earnestly for the faith once for all delivered to the saints. But how do you do that if you don't know what faith is? Now, I know most Protestant denominations claim that the historic Christian faith can be determined from the Bible. But a simple comparison of the multitude of doctrines taught by Protestants makes it pretty clear that's not true. And the terrible result of this is that the early church history is left far too often to the revisionist history of the Roman Catholic Church. And I tell you what, the world is in desperate need of knowledge. Hosea 4:6 says that my people perish for a lack of knowledge. But, all you got to do is take a little bit of initiative, and that knowledge is out there. There's tons of writings we've been left from all periods of the church, even the earliest. And it's really not difficult to determine what was important to those churches that the apostles started. And as we see certain doctrines introduced at later periods into the teachings of our churches, you can conclude that these doctrines were not apostolic. They didn't come from the 12 or from Paul. And after the reign of Constantine in the early 300s and the first general council of the church at Nicaea, a couple of really important things happened. One, the churches now had an official means to declare and decree doctrine. Doctrines that were universal in the church. Before that time, we were likely to have to come to a common source, the apostles. But there was no hierarchy now to establish new doctrines universally. Man decided to do this on his own. Most of the citizens of the Roman Empire had to become Christians because Constantine made it the official religion. And it's almost impossible after Nicaea to find anything resembling the churches before Nicaea. No longer were the churches gatherings of the chosen, the Christian faith. The churches consisted mostly of those who were just doing what everybody else was doing. And it's the same way today. Jesus said, I think it was in Matthew, that the prophets had to be judged by their fruit. And in all of early church history, it's possible not just to see the apostolic origin of doctrines, but also the non-apostolic. It's possible to see the fruit of new doctrines as they arrived on the scene. And you got to ask yourself, where did these doctrines originate? Are they from God or are they from man? So here, take some notes. Let's go from the 1st century AD for the first 100 years. And it seems strange that Jesus was born 3 years before, in 3 BC is what I'm trying to say. But it's very easy to understand and explain. The method for counting years that we use today was not developed until 525 AD by a monk, Dionysius Exiguus. Now, I don't know how he did this, how he made these calculations, but he figured out that it had been 525 years since Jesus was born. And I believe he was wrong, but that didn't prevent the Catholic Church from stopping using his calculations. Now, I know he was wrong. King Herod died in 4 BC, and Josephus tied Herod's death to an eclipse, which also occurred in 1 BC, but other evidence makes the 1 BC date less likely. And most scholars say that Herod's death was in 4 BC. That means Jesus could not have been born later than that, right? Herod ordered the death of all the children under 2 years old in Bethlehem. And Jesus narrowly escaped this when he went to Egypt with his parents. So Herod died, you see that in Matthew 2:15, and generally, I've always heard that Jesus was born in 6 BC, which would allow time for those events to happen. Now Luke, in his gospel, offers a little clue about the age of Jesus. He says that John began to baptize in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. That year was September AD 28 to September AD 29. And he adds that Jesus was about 30 years old. I get that from Luke 3, verse 1 and 23. So 30 years runs you back to 3 BC. But the problem is, Luke was writing decades after the events he was describing. And he says that Jesus was about 30. Well, that's not very precise. So, I really don't, it doesn't make much difference to me when Jesus was born or when he was not born. I really do just want to get to the first church, if you will. So, you remember I taught you about the Apostle Paul going up to meet the apostles at the Jerusalem Council, right? That was like 52 AD. And in that same year, Paul appeared before Proconsul Gallio in Corinth. And you see that in Acts 18. Now, the significance of this, because it's a firm date, Gallio would not only have been proconsul for a year, and there are fragments of a letter written by Claudius Caesar dating his proconsulate to AD 51 or 52. In 54, Corinthians is written, and that's the first reference ever to the Gnostic teachings in the early church, 1 Corinthians 15. Then in 64 to 67, Paul and Peter were both put to death by Nero. Now, there's a lot of tradition about the death of Paul and Peter, but there's really no testimony. Tacitus does not say that Nero persecuted Christians after the Great Fire of AD 64. Tacitus did say that Nero did that. And some give the date as early as AD 60. But I think that Paul's captivity at the end of the book of Acts ended in his release. There's a lot of early church testimony that Paul went to Spain and possibly England and was later put to death. Now, that's conjecture. But in 70, Jerusalem is destroyed by Titus. Now, chances are the earliest Christian letter outside the New Testament was written by Barnabas. And Clement writes a letter from Rome to Corinth. That's the earliest certain date for any type of Christian writing outside the New Testament. And the letter is from the church at Rome, not Clement himself. But it's always been attributed to Clement specifically. That was in 98, soon after John died. Now, we start getting into the real heavy hitters after the apostles were all dead. Who comes first? Irenaeus. And Irenaeus said that John lived up until the time of Trajan. Irenaeus sat at the feet of his teacher Polycarp, and Polycarp was appointed bishop of Smyrna by the apostle John. So Irenaeus' testimony on this matter carries some weight, right? Clement of Alexandria says the same is his who is the rich man who will be saved. Now, according to tradition, John lived to be almost 100 years old. So in the year 99 AD, all New Testament writings are finished. John, the Apostle John, who according to early church testimony was the last of the four evangelists to write his gospel, was said to live in the times of Trajan. So it's possible that his gospel and even his letters were not written until around the same time. Now again, the book of Revelation was completed way earlier, I believe, and is usually dated before AD 70. Some theologians have it up in the mid-80s. I don't believe that. So let's see, who comes next? There was, in the 2nd century, that's 107 to 116 AD, a guy named Ignatius. And Ignatius was martyred, and he wrote 7 letters, and there's still controversy about this. Nobody knows a whole lot about Ignatius, except that what is contained in his letters and his martyrdom. Now, most theologians accept Ignatius' 7 letters as genuine. So, from 107 to 155, you got this guy Polycarp, who John appointed as the Bishop of Smyrna. Polycarp, very interesting guy. And he wrote a letter to the Philippians sometime during the period of 107 to 155. And he's said to have been appointed by John in 116. And his martyrdom took place around 155 AD. So the person who wrote about his martyrdom is a man named Eusebius, who also wrote a church history through 323. And it lets us know that the text we have for the Bible is reasonably accurate, though there have been several interpolations of miraculous events that did not happen. Now, AD 125, Aristides writes the first church apology. Now, an apology is not what it sounds like. It's a defense of the faith, which was then presented to the Emperor Hadrian. Now, in 132 to 136, Bar Kokhba happened. That's the Jewish insurrection against Hadrian. And that happened for a couple of reasons. The temple at Jerusalem had fallen in 70 AD by Titus, right? So it was the Bar Kokhba rebellion that ended all Jewish claim to Israel and Jerusalem for centuries. And this guy, the emperor of Rome, Hadrian, was extremely angry and had Jerusalem plowed down, just plowed down with oxen. He sold a lot of Jews into slavery, built a new city where Jerusalem used to stand. He named the city Syria Palestina, and then began to persecute the Jews that were left. No Jew could observe Sabbath. No Jew could be circumcised. All the other Jewish rituals were done away with. This was Hadrian. So I referred to this letter of Barnabas, for example, and that deals in great length with the law of Moses. It mentions the destruction of the temple, dating AD 70. But the letter of Barnabas, the result is that you can date the letter of Barnabas to somewhere before 130. Now, in 155, this new church father named Justin Martyr makes his appearance. Now, he was a very prolific writer, and I believe he wrote the dialogue with Trypho, which preserved much of Jesus' teaching on the road to Emmaus, where Jesus said the things concerning himself in all the scriptures, Luke 24:27. And Justin Martyr inaugurates the age of the apologists, and he's followed by Theophilus, Athenagoras, Irenaeus in 185, Tertullian 200 to 220, and Tatian. Now, Polycarp is murdered in 165, he's martyred. In 168, Theophilus dates the creation of Adam and the fall of Rome 300 years in advance. In 177, Athenagoras wrote a plea for the Christians. That was a description of the Trinity that mentions the same substance of the Father and the Son, the Holy Ghost. A guy named Homoousios would eventually be a word named Homoousios would eventually be the main issue at the Council of Nicaea in 325. And this is what that was about. It says to employ a language which makes a distinction between God and matter, and the natures of the two. For as we acknowledge a God and a Son, his Logos, and a Holy Spirit united in essence. And then in 183 to 186, Irenaeus writes against heresies. And that was the most thorough book on Gnosticism ever written. Gives you a really good glimpse of the early church theology. It pulls back the curtain like no other writing of its time. Now, Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp who knew John, sat under his teaching. So Irenaeus is the strongest witness to the apostolic age of his time. Now, from 190 to 200, Clement of Alexandria teaches new Christians in Alexandria and leaves tons of writings. He wrote about everything. He talked about exercise, men should strip and wrestle, women should clean house, clothing, drinking alcohol, music, manners, anything you could think of were covered in the miscellanies and the instructor. Then, and we're getting closer now to the actual Catholic Church, in 200 to 220, Tertullian, who was a Christian lawyer from Carthage in North Africa, wrote several books, and Tertullian was bothered by a lack of separation from the world in some Christian areas. And he wrote lots of books on lots of subjects. He wrote to avoid the Roman games, he wrote to not wear a crown, he wrote against the Roman religion, against various Gnostics, against heresy in general. His Apology is a terrific description of the early church as it entered the 3rd century. He wrote a paper that said against Praxeas, And that is the most thorough description of the Trinity in the early Christian writings. He's the first person to use the word Trinity. Now, this guy Tertullian, because he was a lawyer also, was extremely caustic and extremely sarcastic. He didn't try and be nice. He pulled no punches. I think I'm a lot like this guy. I find his writings interesting, but I don't know how effective they were. He got so frustrated with what he considered a lack of holiness. Now, that's something that you have to address if you're a Catholic. I mean, they put on a good show, but as far as real holiness is concerned, I don't see any. He joined like a monk, a monastery, a Montanist sect. And eventually he repented and returned to the Catholic churches. Now, back then, Catholic, in this context, meant the unity or the united early churches that were started by the apostles, not the Roman Catholic Church. That didn't exist yet. The Catholic churches were the ones that were started by the apostles. Now, don't get this confused. The Roman Catholic Church is something totally different. Now, from 220 to 203, the early church grew larger and more organized. And then persecution seemed to stop, right? And as the 4th century started, from 301 to 311, the Great Persecution began. An emperor by the name of Diocletian ordered an empire-wide persecution of the early church. In 305, he retired. He was the only Roman emperor ever to do so. A man named Galerius continued his policy of persecution for another 6 years. There were 4 emperors during this time. The emperors in the West didn't always carry out the policies of the emperors in the East, but Galerius did. In 311, Galerius issued what was called the Edict of Toleration, which was meant to end the persecution. And in year 312, a man named Constantine the Great had a vision of a cross. So on his way to fight his co-emperor, Maxentius, Constantine has a vision of the cross with these words, "In this sign conquer," written under it. So he won the battle and attributed his victory to the Christian God. He became a supporter of the early church. In 313, he and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, which restored Christianity as the religion of the nation. And in 313 through 337, Constantine's reign brings favor to the early churches. He was received with great joy by the early churches. They were grateful he had not only ended persecution, but granted them favor. Now, Roman citizens began flocking into the churches. And even though Constantine remained the head of the Roman pagan church, in 318 to 325, they have what's called the Arian controversy. This guy Arius comes up with a slightly different explanation of the divinity of Jesus and his relationship with God the Father. When he was corrected by the church, he refused to back down. So he was excommunicated by the church in Alexandria in 321. Well, that didn't do any good. Eusebius is from Nicomedia. He took Arius in and promoted his doctrines. Arius began writing jingles, teaching them to children, tradesmen, sailors. His doctrines began to spread, and they threatened to cause a split in the church. Now, Constantine was involved in this civil war with Licinius. In 324, he was victorious, and he united the empire. The Arian controversy would not only split the church, but this newly united empire. So he called all the bishops of all the early churches to Nicaea, which was in modern-day Turkey, and he wanted to resolve the dispute. So, in 320, Eusebius of Caesarea writes ecclesiastical history. He writes this: "A different Eusebius than the one at Nicomedia, is perhaps the most important book in Christian history. It quotes extensively from early writings, preserving some and helping us identify others that we would otherwise know nothing about. It is to this day the best overview of the first 3 centuries of Christianity. Now, here's something very important. In 325, the Council of Nicaea does meet. And almost as important as the council is the fact that Constantine sat as its moderator. So the intimate interaction between emperor and early church is going to carry all the way into the Middle Ages without stop. The Council of Nicaea issued an official creed based on the early church's rule of faith. It condemned the tenets of Arianism, although the Arian controversy would not be resolved until the Council of Constantinople in 381. But another important issue at the Council of Nicaea was the official approval, listen to this, of the patriarchs, bishops of Alexandria, Rome, and Antioch, and they were given huge authority over extremely large provinces. This would eventually lead to the Bishop of Rome becoming Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. Now the other patriarchs, several have been added since, become leaders of the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is basically the Catholic Church in the Greek area. Now listen, in 325 to 381, the fall of the Church, the resolution of the Arian controversy, and the rise of monasticism begin. Unfortunately, the Council of Nicaea did almost nothing to resolve the Arian controversy. So this guy Arius was banished from the empire. He eventually appealed to Emperor Constantine. Constantine ordered the church in Alexandria to begin reconciling with him. But when Arius went to Alexandria, he died. A lot of people think he was murdered. I happen to believe that. So histories of Christianity were written in many centuries. The 5th century, from 400 to 499. They told us about the murdering of Arius. And the difference between Eusebius, the ecclesiastical history in 323, and the later histories are marked with violence, political intrigue, war, deceit, and murder. All this happened regularly after the emperors became involved in Christianity. And the problem now was that almost everyone was a Christian. But very few of them still really wanted to know who Christ was and how to follow him. Those that did often formed communities of committed disciples. The first monasteries, the first monks. Others simply left the cities to live out in the desert, find a way to eat out there. They were the first Christian hermits. And during the 4th century and throughout the Middle Ages, there was a great political power in being a bishop. Man, there was money in it. It was common for ambitious and unholy men to push their way into that position, or to pay a government official to become a bishop or a pope. And that led to great church corruption. Matter of fact, it wouldn't be unfair to say that the church fell during this period. The testimony of the pre-Nicene churches has never been known since. So, I think that's going to do it for us as far as the teachings on the early church are concerned. It's really interesting. People, I would recommend heavily that if you really want to know what went on in the early church from the apostles on, you get this book, The Story of Christianity by Justo Gonzalez. And I'm telling you what, it'll answer a lot of questions for you. So, how much time have we got? You know, I'm not even going to start with my study today in Hebrews. We're already at 30 minutes. I didn't think I would have taken that long. But we'll get back to Hebrews on Monday. I hope you all have a great weekend. This is Jim Sedore. I am your personal preacher. You're listening to the Bible Exposition channel. Hope you all have a great day. God bless. This is Jim Sedore. I am your personal preacher. I wanted to thank you for listening to the Bible Exposition channel.